And so my name is Samantha and I'm part of the Embracing Oneness team. And I've been a meditator with the Brahma Kumaris for a while now, and also have a background in education. I spent quite a lot of time in Southern Africa teaching meditation, and that's where I had the fortune to meet Fatima Dike. And so Fatima, very, very warm welcome again. We had many conversations prior to this, just listening to Fatima's stories. And we were not sure if you were going to be here, Fatima, but you are in the flesh. So we are so happy. And so just to give you a little introduction to Fatima, and I think I've known you, Fatima, for, I don't know, maybe 15 years or so, since I was in Southern Africa. And Fatima Dike is an inspiring storyteller. She's a writer and a playwright from South Africa. She was born in Langa, which is a township in Cape Town, and lives there to this day. She lived during the apartheid system, which is an institutionalized racial segregation system. And many of her stories, the two stories that she's going to share today, is actually from that time period. And one of the stories actually formed the basis for her play called The Glass House. She also runs a theatre group, which she co-founded, assisting young writers and allowing them to realize their dreams. I know now she's busy in the family business. I think lots of stories there too, Fatima. I'm sure you can share that. And so Fatima's first story is going to be entitled My Mum and Mr. Rogers. So Fatima, over to you, and a special welcome. And just to say actually that some of the qualities that I've seen in Fatima when I've had interactions with her is that she has this ability to really create a sense of belonging. She's very, very light and a deep sense of wisdom. So that's what we're going to hear from her today. So again, Fatima, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon, Sam. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honor for me to be here today. I already feel like an ancestor from all the things that were written on the poster. Anyway, as Sam said, my name is Fatima. My surname is Dike, and I am a Xhosa. And the meaning of the word Dike means a natural pool, not a swimming pool in your backyard, but a natural pool. So anyway, my story is about Mr. Rogers, who was my mother's employee, and my mother, Annie, who was Mr. Rogers's maid, now known as housekeepers. My mother worked for Mr. Rogers for 30 years. And Mr. Rogers was a group of white English-speaking South Africans who lived in the black township of Langa, simply because he and all those other white families that lived in Langa, which were about 4 or 6, worked for the city of Cape Town. And their job was to manage the black township of Langa. And so my mom was Mr. Rogers's maid. My dad worked for the city of Cape Town under Mr. Rogers. He was a wardsman. And the duty of wardsmen in those days in the townships were to switch on the lights on the street in the morning, switch them off in the evening. So they used to ride around in bicycles. And then to make sure that people got accommodation, people got houses to live in from the city of Cape Town, and people who were migrants also got places to sleep in the single men's hostels that were built for Black men who were migrant laborers in South Africa. And I come from that background. Both my parents were staunch Methodists. My mother and my father holding high positions in the women's union and the men's union in the church. And so my mother would sometimes have to go and sleep at Mr. Rogers's house, when Mr. Rogers and his wife went out in the evenings so that she could look after Mr. Rogers' two daughters, Vera and Maureen. And so that was life for us normally. My mom was never at home. She was out there looking after these two white kids. And then in 1962, the South African government at that time, which was the National Party, invented a new law called the Group Areas Act. And the Group Areas Act further divided people of South Africa once again, which means all the white people who lived in Langa Township and all the colored people of mixed race who lived in Langa had to move out of Langa so that Langa becomes totally a Black community. And so Mr. Rogers and all the white families moved out of Langa and he went to live in St. James. But over the years, Mr. Rogers kept contact with my mother through Thomas, who was the gardener for Mr. Rogers in those early days. So every Christmas, Mr. Rogers would phone the City of Cape Town office in Langa, ask to speak to Thomas so that he could tell Thomas to tell Annie, his ex-maid, that he will be coming to visit on a certain day, just before the Christmas holidays. And this became a ritual. Mr. Rogers would always come to my house in Langa in December, just before Christmas. And he would bring my mother plants because my mom loved flowers like nobody's business. So he would bring plants. And then when Mr. Rogers came, I noticed in later years, especially in the 70s, because in the 70s, there was the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. And so we became aware of the racial inequalities in South Africa. But every time when it was that time of the year, Mr. Rogers comes to visit my mom would, to me, would adopt the position of the maid again. She would wear her overalls. She would put a starched tablecloth on the table of the house, and she would prepare tea for Mr. Rogers exactly the way she used to 30 years before. And then when Mr. Rogers arrived, she would run down the little path from the door to the gate, all smiles and happy, master, master. And she would open the gate. Mr. Rogers would come out of his car, open the boot of his car, take out the plants that he brought for my mom, hand them over to my mom over the gate, and the two of them would walk into the house, where my mom would take the plants and put them away, and then she would put the tea and all the other food that she had made for him on the table. She would not dish or make herself a cup of tea. She would just sit on the opposite side of the table and have conversations with Mr. Rogers while he was having his tea. It's in the 70s that I began to notice this relationship and what I saw as inequalities in the relationship. And then my sister married a businessman, and one of his businesses was a butcher shop. So I had to go and work for him at the butcher shop. So it meant that when Mr. Rogers comes in December, my mother would have prepared a super leg of lamb for him while he would bring her the plants. So that there was always this exchange of presents between the two of them. And then after one of those visits, I just asked my mother very quietly, why do you still call him master? Because you don't work for him anymore. My mother stopped and she turned around and roared like a lioness. And she said to me, shut up. There are things you will never understand. And as I shut up, a voice inside me said, you are right. This I will never understand. You don't work for this man anymore, but you still call him master. And then that didn't stop them from meeting every time at Christmas. I had to bring the leg of lamb 2 days before, wrapped in greaseproof paper, brown paper properly, put it in the fridge and let mom know that was the leg of lamb for Mr. Rogers. But then I got worked up by this relationship. So one year, I just decided he's not getting the leg of lamb. So I took the leg of lamb and I chopped it up and I put it in the pot and I cooked it for the family for dinner. That was that. So the day before Mr. Rogers arrives, my mom goes to the fridge to check if her gift for Mr. Rogers is there. And the gift was missing. And of course, I had to bear the brunt of my mother's anger. I had to go to the shop, cut another leg, wrap it up the way she wanted it, bring it home. But the extra punishment now was that I had to write Mr. Rogers on the leg of lamb, which I did. But there was one thing that I used to notice whenever they got together, is that they were having these deep conversations in very soft voices. And as much as I wanted to hear what they were saying, I could never hear what they were saying. And so this fight between my mother and me about Mr. Rogers continued until 1977, when there was the war in the former Rhodesia, which is now known as Zimbabwe, when Mugabe was fighting for the freedom of his country. My mother started a new ritual now. She would come to my house because she now worked for my sister, who was a businesswoman. So she looked after my sister's house and her kids, and she cooked and did everything for both families. But definitely every evening at 7 o'clock, she would come into her house, switch the television on, and stand on her feet and watch the news. And then when the news was over, she would just turn around and walk away. But then one evening, I think she wasn't aware. She was thinking loudly. And as she turned to leave, I heard her saying, God, I wonder if Vera and Maureen are safe. Because Vera and Maureen at that time were married to farmers in Rhodesia. And it was during that period of the war for freedom between Mugabe and the president and that government that was in place in Zimbabwe. Of course, I lost my cool completely. I mean, I'm a member of the Black Consciousness Movement. Here's my mother worrying about 2 white kids that she brought up, who never had the decency to even write her a letter and say, Dear Annie, don't worry, we are safe. So I just completely lost my cool and I said, why would you worry about 2 white kids that you brought up that never had the decency to even write you a letter, not to put your heart at ease about what is going on in Zimbabwe? Again, the lioness came out of my mother and she turns around and roars, shut up! There are things you will never understand. At this point, I thought, yeah, the way this story of ours is going, I will never understand. So I thought, let me share my feelings with my sister, the one who is the business lady. I come after her. So we're sitting in the car, we're driving around, we're doing business together. And I said, I don't understand this thing with Mom and Mr. Rogers. Every time when Mr. Rogers comes to visit and bring her gift for Christmas, my mom takes on the position of the maid again. She puts on the starched overall, does all these things, and yet she doesn't work for him anymore. What's going on? My sister said, Fats, my mom and Mr. Rogers have had a relationship for 30 years, which we may not understand. and you just have to be patient, and maybe you will understand this relationship. I just felt my sister sold out. Really, she just sold out. Anyway, Mr. Rogers passed away, and Thomas, his former gardener, they got a phone call from Mr. Rogers' wife, and Mr. Rogers' wife told Thomas to come and tell Annie that the master had passed away. My mother picks up the phone, calls her daughter Nomahlubi, who has a car. Nomahlubi, Mr. Rogers has passed away. He is being laid to rest on Wednesday. I want you to bring your car around so that Thomas and I can go and bury the master. My sister arrived in her champagne-colored Mercedes-Benz. My mom came out in a best suit. Thomas was also wearing his best suit and his brown hat. And they sat at the back of the Mercedes-Benz. And my sister drove them off to go and bury the master. It took me, I think it took me a lot of time, I think 10, 12 years, before I began to understand my mother's relationship with Mr. Rogers. I met a lady called Sue Clark, who was white. She was a friend of mine. We became very great friends. She's the woman who introduced me to theater. How I became a playwright was through her. I was a poet before I was a playwright. She introduced me to the first Black poets who were published in South Africa. She just taught me so many things, took me to so many places that I wouldn't have personally have been able to go to without her. And so one day we're sitting at the flat just chatting, like friends do. And suddenly she starts talking about something very personal. And then she said, you know, Dickles, that's what she used to call me, Dickles. You know, Dickles, Mafu and I were talking about this very same thing. And that at that moment, I just stopped dead in my tracks. Mrs. Mafu is Sue Clark's maid. And I said, Sue, do you talk about these things with Mrs. Mafu? And she looked at me and laughed as if I was mad. She said to me, of course. I spent the entire day with Mrs. Mafu in my house. So why shouldn't I talk to her? And of course, why shouldn't you talk to her? What came to me at that point in time was how brainwashed the system of apartheid had made me to be, to believe that Black people and white people can never cross that bridge and become friends intimately. And that was what was happening between my mother and Mr. Rogers. Because my mother worked for Mr. Rogers for 30 years. She knew all the family secrets, all the intimate things about that family. So whenever they sat at that table at my mother's house, they would be talking about Vera and Maureen being married in Zimbabwe to these white farmers. They would be talking about personal stuff between the two of them, perhaps about her family and his family. And when that dawned on me, I understood.
Thank you.
Shall I continue?
No, well, we would love, I can hear you the whole day. I'm sure others too, others can as well, but thank you, Fatima. Every time I hear that story, it must be the fourth time. It's always so powerful. And thank you for just sharing your journey with us so honestly and openly. And I think maybe just to take a pause moment, just to really digest what you've shared, Fatima, which has been so powerful. So let's just have a moment just to reflect on that story and what really came up for you. And there are a few questions that you can reflect on if you just put up the next slide. in the silence. You may have your own question, but there are 4 questions here and you can choose one, and please write your reflections in the chat box when you're ready to do so. So how did the story make you feel? What inspired you? What values or virtues did you see being played out? And the last question, what did you learn about embracing oneness? When you're ready, you can just jot down a few things in the chat and Ella will facilitate that for us. You can see there's lots of beautiful comments in the chat, and perhaps Ella, you can just pick up a few of those comments that are resonating with you.
So a couple of things have stood out. The first one, the story made me hopeful and appreciative of oneness. The human connectivity may appear strange to us, but true friendship connects through love and respect. What a beautiful story. Most of them continue in that vibe. It's possible to relearn our deep-rooted beliefs, especially relearning the ones that encourage separation. And that's so true, as we can all see what's going on in the world today. We need to honour each and every interaction we have. Every relationship is unique, and we have to be careful reading things into it. And it's true, we can be so easily swayed towards separation rather than oneness. And then this last value and virtue of tolerance and a soul consciousness, seeing the other as a sibling soul. Isn't that beautiful, that we could all be sibling souls? Love that.
Thank you, Ella, for facilitating that. And thank you to everyone that wrote in the chat, and so many beautiful comments. We're going to hear a second story from Fatima now. If we just bring up that slide. And this second story is quite graphic. And as you know, apartheid was a very difficult, not just a difficult time, a very violent time. And so Fatima shares a story which may cause a little bit of discomfort, but I'm just going to encourage you just to hold the space for each other, but especially for Fatima, because I think when you tell a story, it's very easy to kind of feel those things once again, to relive it. And so just to really be compassionate as you tune in, but also to hold the space for each other, because it may also trigger things in our own stories. And so Fatima, the second story, Race Divides Us. So over to you, Fatima.
Thank you, Sam. In 1976, the youth of South Africa decided that they'd had enough of the system of separate development. And so the students from Morrison Isaacson High School on the 16th of June left school early in the morning and started marching through the streets of Soweto, carrying banners that said they did not want to be taught in the language of the oppressor. They did not want this education, which was specifically made for Black people. And so one of the biggest revolutions happened in our time in 1976. And then a month later, on the 11th of August, 1976, I am now working as a playwright at the Space Theatre. I've just written my first play called The Sacrifice of Kheli, which was based on the 9th Frontier War between the British and the Xhosas. And it's 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm just about to have my breakfast and I hear this music filling the entire township of Langa. Could just like, it was like a choir made up of 1,000 voices. And suddenly I stop and I think, what's going on? Most of the people in the township have gone to work. All the kids are supposed to be in school. Who could be singing on the streets at this time of the morning, and why? So I go out of the house and I stand on my veranda and I look up and down my street, but I don't see anything, but I can still hear the music. So I run down my street to the main road and I stop. I look left, I look right, and there they were. The students from Langa High School were marching in fours, and they were all dressed in full school uniform. And they had these big white banners at intervals, which were written, "We do not want to be taught in the language of the oppressor." And the next one would say, "Down with Afrikaans." Now, if you don't understand the word Afrikaans, Afrikaans is a mixture of Dutch and other languages that was created after the Dutch settlers came to the Cape. And the government of the time was trying to get all the Black schools to be taught through this language, which made things even more difficult for the Black kids who were in schools. I stopped. And as I watched these kids marching down the main street of Langa, Washington Street, with such dignity, I feel ashamed, because I went through my entire schooling doing certain subjects, not all of them, but certain subjects in Afrikaans as the government was introducing them. And here, right here in front of me, in 1976, young children in high school were saying, "Stop, that's enough." And as I was still admiring the courage of these young people, suddenly the entire street was flooded with police vans driving up and down the march, making U-turns and coming back. And I was getting the feeling that they were trying to make the students nervous, but the kids were not nervous at all. They just maintained their dignity and continued to march. They were singing a song, but this was not a song, it was a hymn that had been turned into a song of protest. And the lyrics were sung in Xhosa, but what they meant, what they were saying, the lyrics were saying, "What have we done? What have we done? Our sin is our blackness." And I'm standing there, and I'm totally blown by the courage that these children had to do what they were doing at that time in South Africa. And then suddenly the mood changed. The police came out. They started taking pictures of each and every student who was in the march as they were marching past. And then at intervals, they would just go to the march, grab 3, 4 kids, throw them into the police van, and drive them off to the police station to lock them up for no reason, because the kids had not committed any violence. They were just expressing their emotions and their feelings. And I'm still standing there in awe, just like even what the system was doing was not able to shake these kids. These kids were focused on what they were doing. They were not going to be violent. They will let the police be violent, but they were not prepared to be violent. And then when they reached the police station, they went across the road, and next to the Methodist church, there's an open field there. And they gathered around the leaders of the march, and they had a talk. And then they all marched across the street to the police station. When the police saw them coming, they locked all the gates. And suddenly, there were 8 or 10 policemen armed inside the police station yard. And so the kids approached the policemen at the gate. They allowed their leaders to talk to the policemen. And the police and the children, the students, asked the policemen that what had happened to the students that they were taking from the march, that they put into their vans and they brought them to the police station. Were they arrested or not? Because if they were arrested, could the policemen give the students a date to appear in court and release them straight away? The police did not like to hear these children telling them what to do. And then suddenly, out came the tear gas bombs. And they were shooting tear gas bombs at these kids. and the kids dispersed and ran across the road. When the tear gas bombing had stopped, the kids went back to the gate, and every single one of them was carrying a white handkerchief. When they got to the gate, they allowed their leaders again to ask the policemen to give them permission, just the leaders, to go inside the police station to talk to the station commander and find out whether those young people that were picked up during the march, were they arrested or not. Again, the tear gas bombs came out and they started shooting at the kids, and the kids dispersed. When the kids went back to the gate, my attention was removed from what was happening in the gate, because there was a young boy, about 15 years old, who did not go to the gate, but went to the side of the police station fence, where there was a black policeman standing there. He said something. He started talking to the black policeman through the fence. I don't know what he said because I couldn't hear. But whatever the young boy said to the black policeman made the black policeman so angry that he came out of the police yard, chased the boy, grabbed him by his school blazer. But the boy just shrugged himself out of the school blazer. And the policeman was standing there holding the school blazer. And we started laughing. There were about 500 of us watching this whole scene. We started to laugh. It was a joke. So the policeman went back into the yard with the young man's school blazer. But this time, the tear gas bombs were accompanied by bird shot. So they were shooting these bird shots at these kids, trying to chase them away. And the kids would run away, but they would come back. And the young 15-year-old went back to the black policeman on the side of the fence. Once again, he started talking to the black policeman. I don't know what he was saying. Again, the black policeman got angry, came out of the gate, chased him, grabbed him by his school shirt, but he shrugged himself out of his school shirt, and the policeman was left holding the school shirt. We laughed again. It was a joke. The policeman went back into the police station yard, locked the gate. When the third wave of students went back to the gate to talk to the policeman, and the 15-year-old went back to the black policeman behind the fence, the black policeman pulled out his service gun. And when the boy saw the gun, he turned around and started to run, and the policeman shot him through the back of his head. I saw his brains flying in that blue sky, and he was still running. But as he put his foot on the pavement on the other side of the road, life went out of him, and his body fell back onto the street. At that point, there was pin drop silence. The 500 people from the community could not believe what they were seeing. There was just silence. And then a minute later, people were screaming. People were yelling insults at the police. People were going mad. People were looking for rocks to throw at the stones, at the police. It was just chaos. And then suddenly, I heard the policemen preparing their guns to shoot. And the people stopped. The teachers from Langa High School walked over to the dead body to pick it up. At that point, somebody in the police station yard had a loud hailer, and he began to yell through the loud hailer, "Do not touch that body. It is government property." They had arrested the 15-year-old in death. He was dead, but they arrested him. The pain, the pain, the pain, the anger, the hopelessness of the situation. I remember I was crying, but my tears were evaporating in my eyes because of the anger. I was boiling with anger. The first thought that came to my mind was that man could have a 15-year-old son. Where was his mercy? That was a child. He could have spoken to that boy as he would be speaking to his son, but he shot him. As I turned around to walk back home, I told myself that we will never be free because they are armed and we are unarmed. I had to go to work that evening at the Space Theatre. I could not go. I went to work the following morning. I was still angry. I think anger is a mild word. So I walked into work. Everybody in the theater is my friend, black, white, colored, Indian, are all one family. But that day, when I saw my white friends, I did not want to speak to them. I said some very rude words to them because I was venting that anger that came from their system that kills our children. And I was venting my anger on my white friends. I got home that evening and I sat and I reflected on my actions at work. I wasn't happy at all because those white people who I call my friends, there was something in them that resonated with me that made me want to be friends with them. Those people in that theater did not give those policemen the guns. They did not pull the trigger. I was wrong. I was wrong. So I went back to work and I apologized to each and every white friend of mine that day. And I told them what had happened and that this what I saw really hit me so hard that I forgot that I am a human being and that you are also human beings. I apologized and people understood because we all lived under the same climate of racism in South Africa. Sorry, I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Fatima. And I think if we can just take a moment of silence just to hold the space for Fatima, she almost relives that again, and also for each other. It's a very emotive experience. Thank you, Fatima, for really just being so open with all of us today. Fatima, I just want to say once again, thank you for your courage and just being such an example of authenticity and openness. Those stories are very, very inspiring, and really I think it's such a good basis for our discussion today. So thanks again, Fats.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone.
Big hug.
Thank you, Sam.
We'll
Thank
hug.
you.
Can we all just embrace her? Can you see us? Go to gallery view. We're just all holding you, Fats, because that's really touched our hearts. So we're just holding you.
Thanks.
You feel that?
Yes.
Nice,
Thank you,
Linda.
Sam. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.